What's up everyone, and welcome to this video. This video is going to be about an article that was written by gamesindustry.biz, and I thought it was really cool because it takes kind of a behind the scenes look at the development of various Square-Enix games. If you're not familiar with Square-Enix, they're responsible for Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, a lot of the most famous games that have ever been made. And I think one really interesting part about this article is the fact that it mentions, I remember hearing this some years ago, thinking what the hell is their problem? But it documents that Square Enix felt that since Tomb Raider only sold 3 million copies or whatever, that was underperforming. And I guess the reason behind that is because the amount of marketing that was required for that game was just insane. So this article kind of goes through their mindset, the different struggles and tribulations, if you will, of Square Enix, and what they had to do to kind of go about changing the culture in terms of what they're going to be making. So it's cool because they kind of go back to what originally made them great developers in the first place. They're kind of focusing on games like Octopath Traveler. Yeah, that's the name. I actually have that game. It's a great game. I would stream it, but I have it for Switch, and Switch is a pain to get set up. I know I mentioned that before. Maybe I'll do that someday. And additionally, I've heard that a lot of the Japanese developers are not as friendly in terms of Let's Plays. So that might be an issue as well. I'll do a little more research into it. But it's cool. It's an old school Japanese RPG style. It's just 8 different characters. And you go through the world and you follow on their stories. And you got turn-based combat. The turn-based combat's actually really good in that game. It has a really cool it's almost like a paper, rock, scissors element. You have different weapons that defeat certain types of defenses, and you have to use those. And you can also level up your attack abilities by using specific powers or whatever. And it's really cool. I really enjoy the turn-based combat in the game. I personally prefer turn-based combat in RPGs. I like Dragon Age's combat. Same thing with KOTOR. I like how it's a mix between turn-based and real-time. But the point is, they're going back towards that style of gameplay because it doesn't require as much money. Because I think Final Fantasy XIII took 6 years. I think 6 years to make, and they had to spend millions of dollars. And if that game does not perform to what they were expecting, they're in a substantial loss. And there was actually the reason why they were actually doing okay during the 3DS and the PSP era was because their 3DS and PSP games were selling really well, even though they were having issues with their console games. You might have heard that they had to redo Final Fantasy XIV from the ground up. So they started that game from scratch. And now Final Fantasy XIV is seeing such a large influx of users that a lot of times, when I go to try to play it, the servers are full. And so I might have to just bear with it and just play through that one day and see if I can get on there. But yeah, I just thought this article was really cool because it gives us kind of a behind the scenes, if you will, mindset of what goes into making video games and the other complications that they have to worry about that sometimes we as fans of the genre don't really take into account. So given that, let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have here. Rising development costs force Square Enix to find its soul. And this is an opinion piece written by Ishan Sadev a couple years ago. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that Square Enix president Yosuke Matsuda doesn't talk the talk without walking the walk. And that's definitely true. Based upon what he goes on to say in this article, I agree with that. In another note, this is a very long article, so bear with me. It's going to take a little bit to get through. Here's an example. Back in May 2013, just prior to him taking over the company from former president Yoichi Wada, Matsuda said to investors that one of Square's greatest challenges was that the sell-through of big-budget games like Tomb Raider, Hitman Absolution, and Sleeping Dogs was slowing down too quickly. So I think that the sell-through of that is the initial release and how many copies they sell, because then people would either wait for sales or they'll go buy a used copy. You may recall the time Tomb Raider shipped 3.4 million units in its first month, but Square Enix reported that the game had underperformed. Alongside both Hitman Absolution, 3.6 million shipped, and Sleeping Dogs, 1.75 million shipped. Industry enthusiasts at the time felt the problem was simply that Square had unrealistic expectations, but there was actually more to that story. Yeah, I remember hearing that, thinking what do they expect? 3.4 million copies is phenomenal. But it was the fact that their marketing budget just got, it just ballooned exponentially. I believe Grand Theft Auto 5 cost $500 million to make and market, and I think $200 or $300 million of that was just in marketing alone, which I find kind of odd, because like a game like Grand Theft Auto 5, you would think that they wouldn't need that much marketing, just a little bit to say, hey, this game's coming out this day, go buy it. I mean, if you're a diehard fan of GTA, I don't think you'd have to have that much marketing directed towards you, While the plan was for these games to have a long tail, Matsuda said that stiff competition from other titles on the market had caused a critical increase in advertisement spend to move initial shipments. This had led to Square-Enix incurring even greater costs on top of the resources to develop those games. This, in Matsuda's opinion, was part of a larger issue with how big budget games were developed in general. One could spend years and immense resources working on a AAA game, but you wouldn't see any returns until the game was actually completed and shipped in its entirety. Once it was out in the wild, it would have to compete with a plethora of other titles in a market where consumers were becoming increasingly selective. This made it difficult to guarantee a return on all of that investment. And another thing I was thinking about is game prices haven't gone up in decades for the most part. I mean, like, I think PS1 games were around $40, and now they're like $60, and I guess there's some special editions that are $70. PS5 games, now that I think about it, might actually be around $70. Maybe PS5 and Xbox Series X. If that's the case, that's like the first time in forever. But I remember as a kid, like getting Sega games and looking at Super Nintendo games. Some of those games were like $70 back in like, the early 90s or mid 90s. So that's like if you do like a cost of inflation adjustment or whatever, it's probably like $70 then. It's probably like $90 or over $100 now, I would think. The solution, Matsuda felt, was to seek inspiration from initiatives like Kickstarter and Steam Greenlight, where you would have money coming in both while working on a game and after it had been released, where the developers would continually remain in touch with their audience, engaging with them and providing project updates whilst tweaking the product. This would allow you to create a product that was more in line with the audience's expectations and would significantly reduce the upfront development costs you would have to shoulder as well. Matsuda viewed this as a win-win. Here's what happened over the years following Matsuda's comments. Okay, so tying into this would be like, what's that game? The Star Citizen? I think it's Star Citizen. That game has been in development forever, and like they just keep receiving more and more money towards the development costs, so they just keep expanding the game. So that's like a viable, business option now. This, in Matsuda's opinion, was part of a larger... Oh, wait, my bad. I totally went in the wrong direction there. Okay, so October 2013, Square-Enix announces Square-Enix Collective, its own crowdfunding initiative meant to help indie developers create games. The collective goes on to facilitate the development of games like Goetia, Tokyo Dark, and many more, and is still active today. August 2014, Square Enix announces Life is Strange, an adventure game developed by Don't Nod Entertainment. Due to financial restrictions faced by Don't Nod at the time, Life is Strange would be an episodic game, with each episode's release bringing in revenue as the studio began work on the next. June 2015, Square Enix announces it is remaking Final Fantasy VII at E3. Later that same year, the company reveals that the project will be a multi-part story broken up into multiple games. I think that was like a great decision to remake Final Fantasy VII, probably their most famous flagship title. I think it was a great decision. And the thing with that, though, is there's a lot of pressure because you have to make sure you cater to original fans, yet at the same time make it amiable towards modern audiences. So there's a lot of pressure in those games. And this will kind of tie into the article a little bit. One of the reasons why Octopath Traveler was so successful is because the developers at Square, they just made a game that they wanted to play. And so usually if you have that kind of passion and that kind of, drive in a game that you're building, it's going to, it's going to resonate with fellow gamers because they can understand and appreciate, that passion that was put into the game itself. Where I'm sure you played some games where it's like, man, why am I even playing this? Like, it doesn't even look like the developer enjoyed making this. These days, Matsuda has been talking about a different initiative at Square, the need for the company to invest in more AA games, that's as opposed to like AAA titles, which don't take upwards of 5 years and several millions of dollars apiece to develop. Games that increase the company's yearly output and speak to its more ardent fans. During a financial results briefing in November 2017, Matsuda was asked for his opinion on the Nintendo Switch, which had released earlier in the year. He replied, "Nintendo Switch is seeing rapid uptake, and we welcome the arrival of such a platform. We intend to be proactive in our development efforts, given that it's a platform that is well suited to the mid-sized titles at which we excel." And that's true. They do have like a really good track record with those games. The acknowledgement had been a long time coming. Square-Enix has generally been most interesting when working on smaller, less extravagant productions than huge AAA titles. And this is like a screenshot of Octopath Traveler. And the cool thing about that game, like one of the things that stand out besides the awesome turn-based combat, the story's pretty good. I mean, they're nothing crazy, but they're endearing, and like you care about what's going on, but it's not like mind-blowing or anything. But it's the graphics, because it's doing this new style called like 2D HD, or is it HD 2D? I think it's 2D HD, and basically it has like 3D like backgrounds with 2D sprites, and it looks really cool, the graphics for it. And so they're actually remaking Dragon Age 3 in this style. And if they remake all the games like that, I think they'll have like a bunch of hits on their hands, because they remade like Final Fantasy 1 through 6, but they're just kind of like, I guess, barely a graphical upgrade. But they redid every game with these type of graphics. I think they could sell all of them easily for $60, and people would buy them. People might grumble, but they would shell out $60 to pay, to play Final Fantasy 6 in an HD 2D remaster for sure. It's also a line of thinking similar to Matsuda's earlier comments about creating products that don't break you financially in the process of making them. Developing a broad range of mid-sized titles was the company's greatest strength during its turbulent Final Fantasy XIII years. The rocky development of that game was somewhat masked by its incredible output on Nintendo DS and Sony PSP, and a number of those titles actually sold rather well globally, keeping Square relatively healthy despite the many issues plaguing it. For instance, the remake of Final Fantasy III on Nintendo DS sold 1.93 million units in its first 2 years. Final Fantasy IV DS sold 1.1 million in its first year. Meanwhile, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII on the PSP sold 2.1 million units, while Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep sold over 1.27 million units. These games were developed on a fraction of the time and budget that went towards Final Fantasy XIII. Yeah, I heard Final Fantasy XIII was like an unmitigated disaster. Like it just took way too long. They lost a lot of money on it. I think that the lead developer left. I think it goes into it in this article, but yeah, that was rough. And they had to redo 14, and they canceled all of the DLC for Final Fantasy 15. So it's like they have a lot of struggles with like these top tier RPGs at times. I mean, I can understand. I guess they're a lot more complex, but I don't know. I think if they have like a focus towards remaking some of the classics, that might be able to give them a reprieve for a while. And I think Final Fantasy VII is a perfect illustration of that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Other DS and PSP games like The World Ends With You, Dissidia, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, Ring of Fates, and The Third Birthday were all great products in their own right, and contributed to Square's status as one of the most powerful publishers on those platforms. Again, each of these games was developed on a much more modest budget and schedule than the tentpole projects, and most of them were received well, keeping the Square-Enix brand relevant during a period when Final Fantasy XIII was navigating treacherous waters. Then the smartphone boom happened. Yeah, I was just thinking the other day, I was like, where did like all of the 3DS and PSP stuff go? And I guess it's kind of obvious when you think about it. It's the fact that like smartphones came about. So a lot of these games that were being made primarily for 3DS, PSP, stuff like that, there's no sense for them making a specific handheld console when you could just have, a game on your smartphone. And I think that's why Nintendo decided to go with the Switch, is because the technology is probably reasonably cheap, because it's just like a tablet, and it still provides that portable functionality. And then once again, they go back to cartridges by using the SD cards. By 2011, Square Enix knew it was in trouble. Final Fantasy XIII, which had taken nearly 6 years to develop was not considered worth the wait. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy XIV, an MMO meant to provide Square-Enix with a consistent revenue stream, had turned out to be an even bigger disaster. Development on that game would shortly be restarted from scratch. In the midst of all this, Final Fantasy Versus 13 and a number of other games would have to be delayed or stalled while the company scrambled to course correct. Final Fantasy as a brand had, as then President Yoichi Wada put it, been greatly damaged. The development of Square's AA titles had more or less dried up too, owing to the fact that a lot of the company's resources were going towards its many troubled Final Fantasy projects. During this period, Square Enix was instead laser focused on delivering a constant stream of microtransaction-driven smartphone games, relying on them to bring in revenue while resources were continually poured into the troubled development cycles of various console efforts, all of which have been positioned to compete with the industry's biggest hits. Thus, the entirety of the Nintendo 3DS generation went by with relatively little support from Square, even though the device was essentially the perfect platform for a Japanese publisher that excelled at mid-sized AA games. An industry-wide narrative predicting the death of portable video game platforms at the hand of smartphones didn't help matters either. Yeah, so they were basically just making this casual smartphone games just to stay in the black, I guess, to keep that revenue stream coming in. Which I understand, but having to put, even if it's just like a little bit of time and effort towards those games just to get that revenue, you're taking away time from other more substantive games. But that's just something that they had to do, I guess, to keep the company afloat. But if they can figure out a way to, like, by what they're talking about, using these AA games and bringing in, excellent profits, I think that would be, better because they're still focusing on quality games as opposed to just like casual games. There's even a famous story about how Bravely Default, considered by many a return to form for Square after a long string of controversial, often underwhelming games, had come to be localized. It wasn't Square that pushed for Bravely Default to be released globally, but Nintendo. That's pretty cool to think that Nintendo was like, yo man, you guys need to realize what your market is more than you do. With Bravely Default, we really thought it'd just be for Japanese people, producer Tomoya Asano revealed to Eurogamer in an interview. But when it was released, Nintendo got in touch and said many players outside of Japan would like to play the game. So what could we do? Together we released a game, even though at first we had no intention of selling it outside of Japan. Following its Western release, Bravely Default went on to sell over 1 million units worldwide. Yeah, so it was specifically this game that caused them to reevaluate what fans wanted. And sometimes I talk to my friends about this. I'm like, it's not really that hard. I mean, there's a market for JRPGs, and you can make them, relatively inexpensively, compared to like a $200 million game. And I think people want, quality stories, remakes of the classics with modern graphics, stuff like that. And I think there's just like an untapped market because for whatever reason, I don't know if they're listening to focus groups or what, but it seems like a lot of game companies just don't make necessarily the games that people want. Like Dragon Age, for example. Phenomenal game. It was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm still playing right now. I'm doing a Let's Play series to it right now. But then the sequel came out. And the sequel was okay, but it wasn't Dragon Age Origins, just done again, which is what I think most people wanted. They wanted like perhaps a lot of the same characters, same setup, just in a different updated format. But instead we had like gameplay primarily revolving around one specific city, and I don't think you could customize your character in that game. I think it was just the one character. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I played it, but I don't know. I just don't think sometimes they think things through all the way. Yeah, so we got that there. And then soon after the game's success, Yosuke Matsuda, who was now president, and the rest of Square Enix found themselves reevaluating audience expectations. Speaking with the Japanese publication Nikkei Trendy in 2014, Matsuda acknowledged the fact that Square had maybe lost sight of what fans of its games wanted from it. Due to having split our development mindset according to regions around the world, we weren't able to see this clearly up until now. But fans of JRPGs are really spread around the world, he stated. Through the means of various networks, the latest information that is announced in Japan is instantaneously spread across fans throughout the world. Whether it's North America, Europe, or South America, there really isn't much of a gap in the relay of information. With that in mind, and all of the collective fans, there's a sense of mass, which loses the image of a niche market. For the new games we'll be developing from this point on, while this may sound a bit extreme, we've been talking about creating them as heavy JRPGs. I believe that way we can better focus on our target, which will also bring better results. Once again, it would turn out that Mitsuda was committed to the statements he made. Here's what happened in the years that followed. January 2014, Square-Enix and Platinum Games began work on action RPG Nier Automata in collaboration with Nier creator Yoko Taro. Released in 2017, it goes on to sell over 3 million units. December 2014, Square Enix announces a new Saga game, the first in several years for PlayStation Vita. Saga Scarlet Grace is well received in Japan, and a port for Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4 is released in August 2018. An English localization for the game is subsequently announced. January 2015, Square Enix releases Bravely Second, a 3DS sequel to Bravely Default, and the game is localized for Western audiences less than a year later. It goes on to sell over 700,000 units worldwide. And so even though that game sold 700,000 units, it was probably, I'm pretty sure it was, more profitable than Tomb Raider selling 3.4 million copies. So that's something to keep in mind. June 2015, Square Enix announces that it has established a new development studio, Tokyo RPG Factory, to facilitate the development of games that will bring back the golden age of JRPGs. The studio's first mid-sized project, I Am Setsuna, releases a year later to lukewarm reviews, but is still successful. January 2017, Square Enix and Nintendo announce Octopath Traveler, a PS1-era throwback for the Nintendo Switch. The game is released a year later and goes on to sell over 1 million units in less than 6 months. That's really impressive. 1 million units in 6 months for that kind of an RPG. That's awesome. And I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I've probably got about 60 hours in it, I think. And I'm probably maybe 80% done with it. It's a good game. February 2017, Square Enix establishes Studio Istolia, a studio aimed at creating new IP. The studio head is announced to be Hideo Baba, former producer of Bandai Namco's Tales of series of JRPGs. These RPGs are supposedly one of the most famous JRPGs out there. Continuously ranked as some of the top tier RPGs in terms of turn-based combat. April 2017. Takashi Tokita, the director of Parasite Eve and co-director of Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is considered by many to be one of the best games of all time, so that's really good. Teases the start of a top-secret project for Nintendo Switch. In February 2019, this game is revealed as Anunnaki, a new action RPG for the Switch and PS4 developed by Tokyo RPG Factory, with Tokita as its creative producer. Each of these titles has helped Square Enix maintain an ongoing stream of releases and revenue in between its more complex projects. Nier Automata and Octopath Traveler in particular have led to renewed faith in the company's ability to tell interesting, mature stories that resonate with longtime RPG fans. And I agree wholeheartedly with that regarding Octopath Traveler. Meanwhile, somewhat tellingly, it has been business as usual for Square Enix's bigger games. Final Fantasy 15 had most of its DLC canceled, and its director has left the company. The long-awaited remake of Final Fantasy VII has had development shifted away from its original developer, CyberConnect 2, to an internal team at Square, a full 2 years after its announcement. One thing I will give Square props for is if they realize something is messed up and they have to start over or make a difficult decision to relocate a game's development like they did for Final Fantasy VII, they will go through with that rather than just release an unfinished or an unacceptable product. For the most part, I think they strive to deliver quality games, and I give them props for that. Meanwhile, games like the recently released Just Cause 4 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider have failed to prevent a decline in profits due to increased amortization of game development costs and advertising spending. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It isn't surprising then that Matsuda has been doubling down on his comments regarding the importance of mid-sized games, particularly for the Nintendo Switch, which is home to a healthy RPG audience and makes for a fitting environment for mid-sized AA games. We base our development resource allocations on the unique attributes of each platform, Matsuda said to investors in November 2017. In particular, Nintendo Switch makes it easier for us to leverage our back catalog of assets and expertise, so we want to be proactive in creating new IP and rebooting past titles for that platform. My God, if they would create Final Fantasy VI, in HD 2D, I would easily get that. I think millions of other people would too. It's often considered, I guess most people consider Final Fantasy VII the best Final Fantasy game, and I understand why. It's truly a classic. I mean, that's why they remade it, for PS4 and PS5. But right up there, if not considered to be better, is Final Fantasy VI. But I don't think it was as commercially successful. Matsuda's goal, as laid out in numerous interviews over the last 18 months, is to use the Nintendo Switch to spearhead 3 initiatives at Square-Enix: to be proactive in the development of new IP, to bring Square-Enix's rich back catalog of titles to the Switch and other modern platforms, to use the Switch to create sequels to dormant IP that hasn't been used in a while. And so far, I would say they're actually doing that. So I think this Matsuda guy is doing a good job as Square-Enix's president. Matsuda moves quickly, and so we've already seen some of these plans come to fruition. Following the release of Octopath Traveler in 2018, Team Asano, the production group at Square behind Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler, has been promoted to its own business division within the company. Business Division 11, which has been set up to develop original titles for the Switch, aims to release at least one game a year, with tentpole games like Bravely or Octopath scheduled every 3 to 4 years. The team recently expanded to include more staff to bolster its development pipeline. Later in 2018, Square Enix released a Nintendo Switch port of The World Ends With You, with creator Tetsuya Nomura hinting that the remaster was meant to gauge interest in a new title. Nomura added that he had attempted starting work on a sequel a few times since 2011, but that time passed without it ever coming to realization. Following this, Square Enix announced that Final Fantasies 7, 9, 10, and 10-2, and 12 are headed to the Nintendo Switch and Xbox One, taking a good chunk of the series multi-platform for the first time. Then, as if on cue, in December, Saga co-creator Akitoshi Kawazu let on that the next Saga game is already in development, following the success of Saga Scarlet Grace. It's an exciting time to be a Square Enix fan, particularly if you lived through the uncomfortable post-DS era, where 9 out of 10 Square games were being announced for smartphones and would often not make it out of Japan. The situation now is far more optimistic. Just between Nier Automata, Octopath Traveler, and Saga Scarlet Grace, the company has released some of the most interesting games we've seen from it in the last 10 years. Best of all, there are more of these sorts of games to look forward to in months ahead, and you won't have to wait 6 years in between each. I would imagine it's also an exciting time to be a developer at Square Enix. The company's mid-sized games have been doing well, opening up an opportunity for Square's teams to work on more such titles across a broad range of genres, settings, and gameplay systems. Best of all, these games let you devote yourself to something other than 6-year-long marathons like Final Fantasy or throwaway gacha affairs on smartphones. On the whole, there's a greater sense of balance at Square now, and after nearly a decade of trying to find its footing, the company has found its soul instead. So I thought that was a really good summary of Square Enix's vision and how they've changed over the past few years in terms of trying to realize what their true purpose is in terms of making quality games for the consumer. And I think it does a good job of exemplifying, the different trials and tribulations that software companies go through. Because oftentimes, we don't necessarily think about, that game, I never thought about the fact that Tomb Raider sold 3.4 million copies, that it wasn't profitable. I mean, I understand, people buy used games, wait for it to go on sale, but you would think 3.4 million copies, that's a lot of money. It should be profitable. But it's like their marketing budget between Tomb Raider and all these other games, it just eats it up. And I'm still kind of surprised, marketing is that expensive. I mean, I get it for I'm not a marketing expert, so I don't understand all the details of it, but I would just assume, and you know what they say about making assumptions, but I would just assume that if there's a really high-end game that everyone's been waiting for forever, you probably wouldn't have to market as much. I don't know, let's say Elder Scrolls 6. I think people that are going to buy Elder Scrolls 6 are probably going to buy it on day one, whether or not, you play a commercial for them. You could probably just put something on YouTube. You could just release a trailer and be it's coming out this date. It'll get millions of views on there, and that's free, and then people would go out and buy it. So that's just my thought and opinions. Like, what do you think about Square Enix's decision to start making more AA games? I think it's going to be great for the industry. I think it's going to be great for us as fans of the genre. And I really look forward to all of these additional games. So let me know what you think. And I really do appreciate you checking out this video and going through this article with me. Until next time, take care.